Okay. Hello, everybody. It is time for some more Star Wars. We're reading Red Harvest, and we're on Chapter 5. Or, I assume it's Chapter 5. They're just kind of randomly numbered and named, so I would assume that means that they're chapters. They're short. But anyway, jumping into it, we are at Chapter 5, Pain Pipe. So, here we go. Master, I'm ready to begin again. 17-year-old Mana Ra'at stood in the center of the Academy's combat simulator, the one the students called the Pain Pipe, wiping the blood from his split and swollen lip. He felt no pain now, only a burning desire to attack and avenge what had been done to him. The fact that the damage had been inflicted by an automatic system as part of his training didn't matter at all to Ra'at. He was angry, and his anger made him strong. Up above, Sith Combat Master Zat Hraken sat back inside the control booth, one hand resting on the wraparound suite of controls. Though he was human, Hraken was built more like an Aqualish, bald, bulky, and broad across the shoulders. His wide olive-skinned face pinched into a perpetual scowl like stapled bundles of oiled suede. The hour was late, and he and Ra'at were the only ones in the simulator. Hraken, the Blade Master Shakweth, like Blade Master Shakweth, had been teaching here at the Academy for decades, and he had seen students like Ra'at come and go, acolytes who seemed to require little or no sleep, who insisted on continuing their training late into the night, sometimes into the morning, and he'd seen how it caught up with them in the end. After a moment's consideration, he tapped the intercom. "That's enough for tonight," Hraken said. "No!" Ra'at glowered up at him with red and baleful eyes. "I want to go again." Hraken rose from behind the control deck and stepped forward so that the apprentice could see him through the transparisteel window. "You defy me?" "No, Master." Ra'at's tone was only slightly mollified, a symbolic obeisance to the Master's authority. I don't know how to pronounce that. I know what the word is. "I only wish to train under the same regimen as Rance Lusk." Hraken nodded to himself. He'd expected as much. From the moment he'd arrived here, Lusk had set the pace for the Academy's most driven pupils, all of whom wanted to fight, train, and study as intensely as he did. What none of them seemed to understand was that there could only be one Lusk, and those who challenged him found themselves sharing the fate of Nictor among others. Still, Master Hraken had to admit that he found Ra'at's ambition intriguing. Ra'at was easily the smallest in his class, wispy-haired and fine-featured, and 2 years of training hadn't added more than a few ounces of muscle to his spindly frame. But he had deep steel in him, a kind of gritty, semi-psychotic rage, and a will to power that drove him to do whatever was necessary to get ahead. He also had some very peculiar ideas. It was Ra'at, after all, who had started the rumors that Darth Scabrous himself was abducting students and taking them up to the tower in an effort to find one powerful enough to succeed him. He'd argued the case so successfully that some of the students and even a few of the masters wondered if he might be right. Now Hraken wondered if he had finally grasped Ra'at's ultimate goal. He touched the intercom again. "All right, then, once more." Without so much as a nod of acknowledgement, Ra'at dropped back into fighting stance, shoulders squared, jaw set. It was as if he had known all along that the Master would acquiesce. "All right, then," Hraken thought. "Let's see how good you really are." He tapped in a sequence of commands and watched the simulator come to life below him. An automated series of heavy, swinging arms arced out from either side, each one of them 2 meters wide, closing in so that Ra'at had to jump to avoid being crushed. He dived between them easily before going into a tuck and roll, successfully dodging the third obstacle, a spring-loaded picador pike, 5 meters long, that thrust itself unexpectedly downward from the ceiling. Kraken nodded again. It had been the pike that had caught Rat last time. Now he was faster. Are you fast enough, though? That's the question, isn't it? How about when you can't see? Picking up a pair of thermal lenses from the counter beside him, Kraken adjusted them over his eyes, then reached over and switched off the lights. Darkness swallowed the room, vast and total. Kraken flicked on the goggles. His vision helioscoped into 100 brilliant variations of fluorescent green before resolving itself into focus, and he leaned forward with keen interest. Down below, the now blond Rat stopped in his tracks, processing what had just happened, and in that second the wall behind him burst open in a whistling array of heavy rubber whips, slashing into the air. Rat jerked forward, but it was too late. The whips drove him to his knees. Kraken saw the apprentice's face clench, his lips drawn back in pain. It's over, he thought, and reached to switch the lights back on. But it wasn't. Rat was on his feet again, instantly, jumping clear of the whips. Kraken immediately realized that the apprentice was no longer hampered by vision or lack thereof. Now he was relying entirely upon the force. When the swing arm came down again, Rat reached up, grabbed it, and actually held on, a move that the Sith Master hadn't seen before, even from Lusk, riding it all the way up to the ceiling. At the apex of its arc, he let go, twisting and launching himself headlong through open space to catch hold of the spring-loaded rod as it came spiking out of the wall. It was a move of unprecedented grace and absolute precision. Rat spun himself around the rod once, twice, 3 times, building speed, and fired himself directly at the window of the control booth. Master Kraken jerked backward. Rat slammed into the transparisteel with both hands, actually clinging there for a split second, long enough for Kraken to see the student's face staring straight in at him. Then he dropped. Kraken whipped off the goggles and turned on the lights. Light roared across the room, filling every corner. He saw Rat standing down below, his face flushed, shining with sweat, shoulders rising and tailing with the, I guess that's supposed to be falling, with the effort of catching his breath. Despite his obvious exhaustion, the apprentice's face was almost iridescent with leftover adrenaline. When he saw Kraken coming down the stairs, his eyes filled with expectation, awaiting the Sith Master's judgment. Interesting, Kraken said. Tomorrow we'll see if you can do it again. Rat blinked at him. Master? Kraken looked around. What is it? Lusk. In combat simulation, has he ever... The Sith Master waited for Rat to finish the sentence, but in the end, the apprentice simply nodded and looked away. Tomorrow, he said. Walking back to the dorm with his cloak drawn up over his shoulders and his wounds throbbing in the frigid night air, Rat stopped and glanced back at the simulation bunker. He was aware of what the other students and masters said about him, how he was too small, too weak, in thrall to his own paranoid delusions, and he didn't care. Tonight he'd shown Kraken what he was capable of. Soon the rest would see. He stepped over a high snowdrift that had formed outside the library, making his way around the eastern wall of the building until he found himself in the shadow of the tower. It was snowing steadily, but Rat could still make out the tracks leading up to the tower's main entryway, 2 sets of prints, along with the familiar tracks of the HK droid. Rat felt the requisite twinge of jealousy. The tracks in the snow meant that Lord Scabrous had brought visitors here, very recently. The Sith Lord had invited them into his sanctum, and they had stepped inside. Rat had never been inside the tower and could only imagine its secrets, wondered who the visitors had been. Lusk, Nictor, one of the masters. Slipping off his glove, Frat placed one bare hand directly on the closed hatchway, imagining for a moment that he could feel the power pulsating out from inside, power that he would do anything to possess. Someday, he thought, I'll go through there myself. Until then, he would keep practicing. And that's the end of 5. Like I said, they're slow. It's almost like they're pages, but the pages are off. It's kind of weird, the setup. So I'm going to read 6. 6, 7, and 8 at the very least. Okay, so 6 is Hot Ships. It was after midnight in the Academy's main hangar. Finishing up the last of his maintenance chores, Purgus Frode found himself glaring at the Corellian cruiser still taking up space in the corner of the landing pad. He'd refueled the craft and kept its engines hot, as its pilot had demanded, but that had been several hours ago, and there'd been no word from the bounty hunters. Now it was late, and he wanted nothing more than to shut things down, go back to his quarters, and collapse into his bunk. With a sigh, he went back to the hangar's control booth and sealed, it says scaled, but I'm sure it means sealed, the hatch behind him. At least it was warm in here, a haven away from the wind. When he'd first taken over the job almost 10 standard years earlier, Frode had retrofitted the booth to meet his needs, installing a personal thermal convection unit for hot meals, along with a data pad for his private holobooks and holomags. As a hired hand, he had no force powers and no particular allegiance to the Sith per se. He'd only encountered Darth Scabrous on a handful of occasions, but the last and only time that he'd ignored orders to stay up and wait, he'd spent a week in lockup icing a broken jaw. Settling back with a reheated cup of Javarican espresso and a well-worn holo of Hot Ships, Frode saw something flicker past the booth. He sat up and wiped a hole in the steamed-up glass, peering out. The HK was standing there, its photoreceptors focused in on him. Frode stood up and opened the hatch. "Hey!" The HK turned and looked back at him. "Query, what is it, sir?" "How much longer are those guys going to be in the tower?" Frode pointed at the cruiser. "I mean, their ship's still sitting there eating our fuel." Response: "I suppose you ought to shut it down." "But that guy Dranik said—" Statement: "He won't be coming back, sir. He or his partner." Frode blinked. "What, you mean like ever?" Response: "That is my understanding, sir, yes." Pushing back his mission cap to scratch his head, Frode turned his attention speculatively back toward the bounty hunter's vessel. "You know," he remarked casually, "a ship like that's gotta carry a pretty sophisticated flight computer." Statement: "I'm sure I wouldn't know anything about that, sir. The equipment of such vessels is not part of my programming, and—" "You don't think Lord Scabrous would mind if I yanked her out, do you?" The HK regarded him blankly. "You know, set it aside, scrap market value on that thing's not too shabby." Statement: "I'm not sure you could help yourself," the droid said, with bottomless indifference, already turning away to go about its business. "Oh, I'm sure you could help yourself. I misread that." Settling his cap back on his head, Frode nodded and got his tools, whistling a little under his breath as he did so. Maybe, he thought, tonight would turn out well after all. See, that's the end of 6 already. That's why I'm wondering if they're just named pages or something. It's weird. 7, Marfa. Hestizo Trace rolled over, drew in a deep, resigned breath, and lifted her head from the pillow. The small, nondescript sleeping chamber where she'd awakened had already begun to fill with soft artificial light. Although she was all alone here, she could feel the orchid waiting for her down below. Some 200 meters away, but close enough to hear its voice quite clearly in her mind. "Hestizo, emergency!" She sat up, pushing off her covers. "What is it? What's wrong?" "My incubation chamber. Come quickly." Realizing now what the voice must be referring to, she relaxed back down. Oh. Oh, alarm flashed through the flower's tone. This is serious. I'll be down in a second. Hurry, please. Okay, she told it. All right. Hold on to your petals. I'll be down there in a minute. The orchid retreated in her mind, only marginally placated, as if still awaiting a formal apology. Honestly, Zoe didn't mind its presence in her thoughts. The bond that they shared was, after all, part of her identity. A Jedi in the Agricultural Corps, one of the talented handful whose psychic green thumb kept her here in the nurseries and labs of the Marfa facility. Marfa was a hothouse, its varying atmospheres, temperatures, and moisture levels all carefully maintained to foster the widest variety of interstellar fauna in this part of the core worlds. But it was the force sensitivity of Zoe and her fellow Jedi that drove the different species to their fullest potential. At 25, Zoe understood that there was innate value, even a kind of nobility in such things. Nurturing every form of botanical life and encouraging every facet of its development and exploration. Rousing herself fully from the last lingering vestiges of sleep, she slipped into her robe and headed up the corridor to the refresher. The faint sense of unease followed her, an unwelcome remnant of some other unremembered dream. Excuse me. She dressed for the day, choosing her lab frock and hood from a rack of identical uniforms, attributing the tinge of restlessness to that same nameless malaise that sometimes waited for her upon awakening here on Marfa. Opting out of breakfast, she followed the concourse up to Beta Level 7. Marfa's planetary status was constantly shifting with the position of solar activity and galactic cloud patterns, but B7 was currently the busiest and most vibrant of the various cultivation and growth bays honeycombing Marfa's surface. Usually, most of her fellow Jedi could be found there in the mornings, starting their day with de facto meetings to update one another on progress and research and share their immediate plans for the future. The turbolift doors opened on an eye-watering expanse of green, and Zoe stopped there as she always did, letting the great familiar cloud of humid warmth wash over her. The smells of countless different plants competed for her attention, sap, fruit, and flower mingling in a mind-boggling bouquet of fragrances. Tilting her head back, she looked up on 150 standard meters of high-ceilinged vines and dangling root systems. All around were narrow, self-sustaining forests of succulents and subspecies, and high trellises overrun with loops and whorls of growth so varied in color and size that only through sheer day-after-day familiarity was she able to process it all. She could already feel them. Her mind tuned instantly to the internal hum of hundreds of different vegetative life forces, each vibrating according to its own particular emotion, some low and oscillating, others pulsing high and bright to match the explosions of flowers that sprang from their stems. Many of the plants were local enough that she recognized their greetings in her mind as she passed by. Zoe walked among them, allowing their rustling enthusiasm of leaves and stalks to distract her from the nagging tug of unease that had followed her up from below. Good morning, Hestazo. Wal Bennis was the first actual voice she'd heard this morning. A tall, soft-spoken man with calm brown eyes. The Jedi Ag Lab director was waiting for her behind the thick red stalks of a Malpaso tree with an extra cup of calf. Sleep well? Until the orchid woke me. Bennis handed her the cup. Any idea of what's going on? I've got a pretty good guess. You do? Mm-hmm. That's good, then. He went distractedly back to his own work, and then seemed to remember something. Oh, and Zoe, when you get a minute, would you mind taking a look at the pulsiferian moss colonies on B2? There seemed to be some kind of secondary parasite growing in the soil. You always save the glamorous stuff for me. You're the only one who can understand it. The moss or the parasite? Both, I think. I'll take a look. She carried the calf across B7 until she reached the private incubation chamber in the far corner of the room. Deactivating the airlock, she stepped inside, resealing the door behind her. Finally, the orchid burst out. What took you so long? You're not the only plant on this level. She took her time checking the temperature and moisture readouts on the wall unit, making incremental adjustments to both, and then walked over to the only plant in the chamber, a small orchid with black petals and a thin green stalk. Its frond seemed almost to quiver with impatience. For a moment she stood sipping calf and looking at it. I was cold during the night, exceedingly unpleasant. Actually, I turned the temperature down in your incubation chamber, she told it, almost a full 2 degrees on purpose. Why? I've been telling you for ages that you're a lot hardier than you thought. Now you know it's true. Fact is, you could probably survive a 20-degree temperature drop, maybe more, and you would have been just fine. That's cruel to test without warning. If I'd told you, Zoe replied, then you would have gotten yourself all worked up over nothing. The orchid withdrew into sulky silence. As Flora went, it was one of the most force-sensitive species in the galaxy. The problem was that it knew it. Zoe put up with it anyway, and most of the time she was happy to dedicate herself to studying its abilities and providing for its needs. Every so often, though, it needed to be reminded why it had endured for thousands of years. It was far more durable than it gave itself credit for. Zoe, the orchid said now. What is it? Something's wrong. What now? Outside, something's happening. Zoe reopened the incubator's hatchway and stepped back out. Standing motionless in front of the chamber, she realized several things simultaneously. First, that the initial sense of wrongness she'd been experiencing up until now had nothing to do with her work here on Marfa. Contrary to what she'd initially supposed, the feeling was emanating from an outside source, an interloper, something that clearly didn't belong here. It hadn't been a dream, it was an alarm. And second, despite the silence, she wasn't alone. Zoe, the orchid's voice asked, what is it? Give me a second. She listened to the entire greenhouse with her ears instead of her mind. She heard no audible voices, but that was to be expected. Her fellow Jedi often worked for hours among their individual species without speaking a word. Much of their daily routine was accomplished in absolute silence. Pausing halfway down a long aisle overgrown with leafy stalks, Zoe looked up. Far overhead, she found that she was looking for, an 800-year-old panopticon willow, a perfect specimen of organic surveillance, draping its limbs in a dense canopy of emerald dripping lace. Each bud was tipped with a tiny golden eye. Zoe placed one palm flat against the shaggy trunk, allowing its root strength to pulse through her, aware at the same time that the tree was embracing her as an equal. She felt her ground-level perspective surging up through its branches, spreading out along colonies of sharply focused eyes. Her vision shifted, wobbled, and became clear again. She was now gazing down at herself and the entire floor from far above. From the willow's point of view, the tree's branches... from the willow's point of view, period. The tree's branches shifted, and Zoe felt a slight shimmer of cognitive dissonance as her perspective aligned itself, and she saw the familiar robed figure of Wal Bennett leaning face first against the sinuous, downy-tufted trunk of a Malpassian squid pine. But Bennett wasn't leaning. He was slouched forward, motionless, his torso hanging at an unnatural angle, arms dangling at his sides, impaled by the spear that had been slammed through his back into the trunk of the tree. A long dagger-shaped blood stain ran from between his shoulder blades down his back, soaking through his belt. The cup of calf he'd been holding lay on the floor between his feet. Zoe realized that she could see Bennis's face. It hung ashen and slack, a dangling meat mask from which all life had fled. His blood spilled down the spear's rough-hewn shaft, and Zoe watched with the willow's unblinking acuity as a droplet formed at the end, grew heavy, and fell into the already congealing pool on the floor by his feet. Plip! Something rustled behind her in the leaves. Spinning around, her consciousness dropping back from the willow's branches into her own optic and auditory nerves, Zoe realized too late that she'd let her guard down. On the other side of the tree, somewhere just inside the thick green canopy, the rustling grew louder and closer. A branch snapped, twigs crackled, trampled underfoot. Zoe felt the presence of this new thing, whatever it was, making its way directly toward her, no longer bothering to be quiet or stealthy. Fear took hold of her, vacuuming the air from her lungs. The buzz of plant emotion had fallen quiet. Even the orchid was still, and the entire research level felt far larger and more desolate than it had just moments before. Glancing around, hearing only the faint click of her own throat, she suddenly wanted more than anything to run, but she was no longer sure which direction to go. The noises she'd heard on the other side of the tree now seemed impossibly to be closing in from all sides. She felt helpless, isolated, alone, except for the buzzing, weightless swarm of her own terror. A shape burst out of the green into full view, 2 meters tall. The bulky, fur-shrouded torso stood well above her. The long, squinting face was inhuman. Cheekbones and brow jutted forward. A pair of stained tusks pushed upward from the lower jaw. The eyes that glinted from beneath its forehead were shining and intent. It was a whiffid, Zoe realized, the biggest she'd ever seen. Somewhere in his chest, he gave a thick grunting sound that might have expressed anything from appreciation to disinterest. Zoe turned and fled. She had taken 3 steps when an arm the size of a load-bearing girder slammed sideways against her skull,